Chicago, October. The wind off Lake Michigan moves through the city like a reminder that everything can change, that nothing lasts forever. Not even loneliness. A man walks into a restaurant. First time wearing a blazer in 3 years, hands slightly unsteady, not from the cold. He sees the woman at the corner table, shoulders shaking, crying, really crying, not hiding it. He stops. First instinct, turn around. This is clearly a disaster, not his problem, especially after it took him 3 years to work up the nerve to be here tonight. But he doesn't turn around one step. Then another. The woman lifts her head, and that face, the face he recognizes immediately, tells him tonight will be nothing like anything he ever imagined. This is his CEO, the woman who signs his paychecks every month without ever knowing his name, crying, alone, at their blind date table. The tie was navy blue. Laura picked it out at Macy's on Michigan Avenue 2 Novembers ago. She held it up against his chest in the middle of the men's department and said it made his eyes look less tired. He'd laughed at that, told her his eyes were always tired. She said that wasn't the point. Timothy Clark stood in front of the bathroom mirror now, that same tie looped around his collar, fingers working the knot out of habit. Third attempt. The fabric kept slipping. His hands weren't cooperating tonight. Which was fine, because honestly, his entire nervous system wasn't cooperating tonight. And he should have told Nicole no on the 5th call, the same way he'd told her no on the first 4. Except he hadn't, because she'd said the thing. The one sentence he couldn't argue with, couldn't file away, couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. He unknotted the tie, folded it carefully, opened the top drawer of the dresser and placed it inside, next to the cufflinks he never wore, and the birthday card Sophie made him in 2nd grade with the lopsided cake drawing. He closed the drawer, pressed his palm flat against the wood for a second longer than necessary. Not tonight. He grabbed the plain gray tie instead, the one with no history. The apartment on West Fullerton had been many things over the years, before Laura. It was a bachelor's place, mismatched furniture, a refrigerator that held mostly beer and leftover Thai food, curtains that were really just bed sheets on a tension rod. After Laura moved in, it became something else. Bookshelves with actual books. A kitchen that smelled like garlic and rosemary on Sunday afternoons. A real couch. Plants that somehow stayed alive. After Laura died, it became a holding pattern. 3 years of holding pattern. The bookshelves were still there. The couch was still there. 2 of the 3 plants had eventually given up the fight, and Timothy couldn't bring himself to throw out the dried-up husks. So they sat on the windowsill, looking like a metaphor he refused to examine too closely. The garlic and rosemary sundaes were gone. Now Sundays smelled like Sophie's favorite frozen waffles, and whatever cleaning product he'd most recently used on the bathroom tiles. He was good at keeping things clean, good at keeping things running, school pickups and lunch money and permission slips signed on time, and dentist appointments scheduled and soccer cleats replaced when Sophie's toes started pressing against the front. All of it. Every moving part of the machine. What he was not good at, apparently, was living Nicole's word, not his. But Nicole had a habit of using words that stuck whether you wanted them to or not. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table when he came out, homework spread in a semicircle around her bowl of cereal. She ate cereal at all hours. It wasn't a breakfast food in her mind. It was a universal food, a food for all occasions and emotional states. She looked up when he walked in wearing the gray tie and his one good blazer. Her expression did the thing. The thing where she looked like she was doing math in her head. You're going, not a question, an observation offered without judgment. Which was somehow worse than judgment. I'm going. Aunt Nicole's thing. Yes, she nodded slowly, looked back at her homework, looked back up. Is your hair supposed to do that on the left side? He patted his head, moved to the bathroom, fixed it, came back out. Better, Sophie said. She had the tone of someone twice her age, and she'd had it since she was approximately 4. Timothy still didn't know where it came from. Laura had been warm and openly expressive. He was quiet, but not formal. Sophie had somehow arrived in the world preloaded with a gravitas that belonged on a federal judge. I'll be back by 10, he told her. Mrs. Patterson is coming at 7:30. I know, she always brings the oatmeal cookies, I know. A pause. Sophie twirled her pencil once. Dad, just that, one word. His title. Delivered with weight she didn't explain. He waited. It's okay, she said. That you're going. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did what he usually did when Sophie said something that cracked something open in his chest. He nodded, grabbed his keys, and got out the door before his face did something embarrassing. The thing about Chicago in October was that it was genuinely beautiful and also completely hostile. The lake pushed the cold in from the east like it was making a point. The leaves on the trees along Fullerton were doing the full theatrical performance. Amber, copper, red that was almost purple in the right light. All of it very lovely, and the wind cut right through his blazer like it wasn't even there. He sat in the car for 4 minutes before starting the engine. 4 minutes of doing absolutely nothing. Hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard, listening to the wind. This was insane. He was a 54-year-old man sitting in a car in front of his own apartment building on a Friday night, working up the nerve to go meet a stranger for dinner. A stranger Nicole had described as lovely and accomplished and someone who gets it, which could mean anything and told him nothing. He'd Googled the restaurant. The Greystone. Nice place. Not pretentious nice, but real nice. Dark wood, good lighting. The kind of menu where the ingredients had their own biography, but the prices weren't completely criminal. Nicole had made the reservation. He'd been told to ask for table 14. Table 14. He started the engine. The drive to River North took 22 minutes. He found a parking spot 2 blocks away, which he took as either a good omen or a completely meaningless coincidence, and then walked to the restaurant with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly hunched against the wind and the very specific, very familiar anxiety of a man who hadn't done this in an extremely long time. How long? He'd had to actually stop and calculate. Laura and he had met at a work happy hour 17 years ago, which meant the last time he'd gone on a first date, he'd been 37 years old, less gray, considerably more confident, and not the single father of a 9-year-old who ate cereal for homework and delivered emotional gut punches with the casual accuracy of someone who wasn't even trying. 37. 17 years ago, he stopped at the corner across from the Greystone, looked at the warm light coming through the front windows, people inside at the tables, doing the normal human thing of eating food in each other's company. He could turn around. Right now, call Nicole on the walk back to the car. Say something came up. She'd be irritated, but she'd survive. Accept Sophie's voice. It's okay that you're going, said like she'd been holding it for a while and finally decided to release it. He crossed the street. The hostess took his name, led him toward the back of the restaurant. Table 14 was in a corner, good for privacy, slightly removed from the main floor noise, and he followed her around 2 other tables and a busboy station, and then stopped. He stopped because the woman at table 14 had her face in her hands, not resting her chin in her hands, actually, in her hands, both palms pressed against her face, shoulders drawn up and then dropping. The small, unmistakable movement of someone who is actively crying, and trying very hard to make it take up as little space as possible. The hostess had already dematerialized back to the front. He stood there, 3 feet from the table, far enough that she hadn't noticed him yet, close enough that he could see the slight tremor in her shoulders, and the way her hair, dark, pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping at the sides, moved with the movement of her breathing. His brain produced several options in rapid sequence. Walk back to the front. Tell the hostess there'd been a mistake. Call Nicole from the sidewalk and describe exactly what he'd found, and let Nicole apologize and feel terrible about it. That was option 1. Option 2 was standing here indefinitely until something changed, which didn't seem like a winning strategy. He took a step forward, then another. Then he was at the edge of the table, and she still hadn't looked up, and so in a voice that came out quieter than he intended, more careful than he planned, "Excuse me. Are you okay?" Her hands went completely still. 1 second, 2, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then she lifted her head. And Timothy Clark's entire understanding of the evening rearranged itself in the space of one breath. Sandra Anderson. He knew that face. Not personally, not in any way that had ever involved direct conversation. Because in 4 years at Anderson and Partners, he and Sandra Anderson had occupied the same building. The way satellites and planets occupied the same solar system. She was up there, he was down here. The gravity didn't really run in both directions. But he knew the face from the company all-hands meetings where she stood at the front of the room and talked about Q3 numbers and strategic direction. and something called organizational alignment, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously warm and absolutely not open to debate. He knew it from the framed photo outside the conference room on the 4th floor, taken at the company's founding. Younger Sandra, sharper blazer, same eyes. He knew it from the nameplate on the door of the office on the 18th floor that he had walked past exactly once when maintenance sent him up to deliver something to the executive assistant. And he had walked past that door like a man, walking past an exhibit at a museum, aware of its significance, careful not to get too close. Sandra Anderson, CEO of Anderson and Partners, the person who technically existed somewhere at the top of the organizational chart above every person who signed Timothy Clark's checks. Here, at table 14, with mascara tracking down one cheek and a crumpled cocktail napkin in her right hand, and the expression of someone who has been caught in a moment she had absolutely not planned to share. She saw him at the same moment she composed herself, or started to, anyway. The posture shifted, shoulders back, the CEO muscle memory kicking in even now, even here, even with the evidence of the last 10 minutes still visible on her face. She stopped. Looked at him more carefully. The recognition moved across her face slowly, and then all at once. "You work for me, marketing." His voice was doing something strange, staying very calm, while the rest of him was conducting an emergency internal meeting. 4th floor. The color in her face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the crying. "My assistant set this up. I told her the name was." "I didn't." She pressed her hand flat on the table. "She said his name was Timothy. My sister said her name was Sandra." A silence stretched between them that contained approximately 17 different things neither of them said. "This is," she started. "Yeah," he agreed. She looked at the table, looked at the wall, looked at him. "Do you want to leave?" Not unkind, almost hopeful, in the way that you're hopeful when you want someone to make a difficult choice so you don't have to. And something happened in him then. Something he couldn't entirely explain and didn't try to. She'd been crying alone in a restaurant and he'd been sitting in a car working up the nerve to come inside. And maybe both of those things pointed to the same problem. "Can I sit?" A beat. "Or I can go. Either way." "Your call." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite a decision. More like a permission she was granting to herself. "Please don't," she said. "Leave." A pause. "Please don't leave." He sat down. The waiter came. They ordered water. Neither of them looked at the menu. The waiter, a young man with excellent professional instincts, assessed the atmospheric pressure at table 14 and retreated without comment. The restaurant noise wrapped around them. Other conversations, the clink of glassware, a burst of laughter from a table near the bar. And within it, the corner was its own separate quiet. Sandra was putting herself back together in the particular way of someone who has a lot of practice making herself presentable quickly. The napkin was folded and placed to the side. Her posture was fully CEO again. Except her eyes, which were still red, which she couldn't do anything about. "I had a whole plan for tonight," she said finally. "In terms of, I had a version of this that made sense. I had answers ready for the standard questions. Where did you grow up? What do you do? What are you looking for?" A short exhale that was almost a laugh. "Didn't plan for the crying in the parking lot part? How long were you in the parking lot?" 15 minutes. She looked at him sideways. "I know. I sat in my car for 4. Something in her expression shifted. Not a smile, but adjacent to one. "What were you doing?" "Trying to decide if I was actually going to come in, and a 9-year-old guilted me into it." He said it without really planning to. The words just came out, not on purpose. She doesn't do things on purpose. She just states things, and then I can't unhear them. Sandra looked at him with what might have been genuine curiosity. "Your daughter, Sophie, 9. She's very sure of herself for someone who still eats cereal for dinner, and that was the thing that shouldn't have worked but did." The way Sandra's face changed when he said that. Not performing amusement. Actually amused. "My grandmother ate cereal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner the last 5 years of her life," she said. "She lived to 91. So maybe Sophie's onto something. I'll tell her that. She'll use it as leverage for at least 6 months." This time it was definitely closer to a smile. It didn't fully arrive, but it was trying. The waiter returned. They ordered. Salmon for her, short rib for him, and neither of them looked at the menu for more than 45 seconds, because neither of them was particularly focused on food right now. When the waiter left, the space between them resettled. She looked at her water glass, turned it slightly. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Did you know who I was when you walked over?" "No. Honest. You were crying, and I almost left and then I didn't." "Why didn't you?" He thought about that. It seemed wrong to walk away from someone crying alone. Most people would have. Most people were somewhere else tonight. She looked at him. Really looked. The kind of look that was taking inventory of something. Then, "I'm 32 years old." She said it like a statement of fact that had recently become a problem. "I've been building this company since I was 24. I started it in my apartment with a laptop and a client list I'd basically assembled by being the most prepared person in any room I walked into for 6 straight years." A pause. "By every external measure, it's working. The company is real. The numbers are real. The office on the 18th floor is real." She stopped. Turned the water glass again. "I drove here tonight thinking maybe this time it could be different. Just dinner. With someone who didn't already know the name. Someone who might see me, and not see the building with my name on it." Her voice was flat and very careful, and underneath the flatness was something exhausted. "And then I sat down, and I started thinking about the last 4 guys who took me to dinner, and how all 4 of them, at some point in the first 3 dates, found a way to mention that they'd looked me up. Like it was a compliment, like I was supposed to be flattered that they'd done their homework." She set the glass down. I'm so tired of being homework." The words landed in the quiet and stayed there. Timothy didn't say anything immediately, because there was nothing to immediately say. Because the honest response was that he understood something about being tired, even if it was a different kind of tired, and sometimes understanding was the whole thing. "That sounds exhausting," he said finally. She laughed, short and sharp and real. "That's the word for it." "Yeah," she looked at him. "I'm sorry. You didn't come here for this." "I didn't come here for anything in particular," he said. "My sister gave me a time and a place and a table number. That's the whole briefing I received. Angela, my assistant, told me his name and that he was kind." She paused. "She's been trying to get me to do this for months. I kept saying no, and then she finally said, 'Sandra, when is the right time going to arrive?' And I didn't have an answer for that." She looked at the table. "I still don't. I told Nicole no 4 times. What changed on the 5th? And here was the thing. Here was the place where he could give her the simple answer. Just wore me down. You know how it is, sisters. And keep the real answer somewhere private where things like that lived. It would have been reasonable. It would have been the move." He looked at the restaurant wall, then back at her. "She told me my wife wouldn't want me to die slowly like this." The table went quiet. Sandra didn't perform a reaction. She just let the weight of what he'd said settle, and she didn't rush past it, and that itself was a kind of response. "Your wife," she said. Careful, not a prompt. Just an acknowledgement that she'd heard Laura. He said the name, and it didn't break him the way it used to. It had evolved, something duller now. Still there, just shaped differently. 3 years ago, brain aneurysm. She was healthy, she was 49, and then one day he stopped. One day she was here and then she wasn't. Sandra was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely name. Not pity. Not the performance of pity that he was so worn out by. "Something more honest than that, Sophie," she said softly. She was six. Yeah. The food arrived. They ate slowly. The conversation moved in and out of silences that didn't require filling, which was unusual. Timothy had been to exactly 3 dinners in the last 3 years that could be described as social, and all 3 had been loud affairs where the silences were treated like emergencies. This was different. The silences at table 14 weren't emergencies. They were just pauses, like punctuation. Sandra told him she'd grown up in Columbus, Ohio, middle-class neighborhood, parents who worked hard and expected her to work harder. She'd been the kind of kid who organized her notes by color and finished assignments a week early, and drove her teachers slightly insane with the volume of follow-up questions she asked. She'd gotten a full scholarship to Northwestern, studied business and communications, graduated early, spent 2 years at a marketing firm in the Loop, where she watched the senior partners make mediocre decisions with enormous confidence, and then decided she could do it better. She could do it better, so she did. "I don't say that like it was easy," she said. "The first 2 years I paid myself in what I'd generously call installments. I ate a lot of peanut butter. I called my mother every Sunday and pretended things were fine. A pause. She knew, obviously. She always knows. But she played along because she understood I needed to believe I could handle it. She sounds smart. She's the smartest person I've ever met. Which she would say is a low bar considering her sample size. She smiled. A real one this time. Not adjacent to one, but actually a smile. And it changed her face in a way that was somewhat startling. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it looked like relief, like a door opening that had been closed for a while. She retired last year. She and my dad bought a little house in Sarasota. She sends me photos of sunsets and asks when I'm coming to visit. A pause. I haven't been to visit. When did she retire? 14 months ago. She said it the way you say something, when you know exactly how it sounds. Ah, yeah. She looked down at her plate. I'm aware. Timothy didn't say anything judging, because he wasn't in a position to judge anyone's relationship with the things they kept putting off. His list was considerable. The vacation he and Sophie were supposed to take last summer. The school play he'd missed in March because Ronald Sanchez had called an emergency team meeting at 6 p.m. on a Thursday that turned out to be about nothing. Quite literally about nothing. A meeting to discuss the possibility of scheduling a future meeting. He had sat in that conference room for an hour and 20 minutes, thinking about Sophie in the school auditorium, looking for his face in the audience. She hadn't said anything. She never said anything. Just smiled and said it was okay. The video was fine. She understood. She was 9 years old, and she understood. That was the thing that kept him up on bad nights. Not the grief, exactly. The grief had its own schedule, and he'd made a kind of peace with it. The thing that kept him up was the running calculation of what Sophie was absorbing and filing away without complaint, the things she was learning about what adults owed each other and themselves, the model he was building for her without meaning to. He realized Sandra was watching him. Sorry, he said. I went somewhere. Where? He considered. Then, because something about the last hour had apparently dissolved his usual guardrails. My daughter's school play, in March. I missed it. What was the show? Charlotte's Web. She was Wilbur. He felt the edge of a smile that was also slightly painful. She'd practiced the oinking for 2 weeks. Actual oinking practice. In the kitchen, after dinner, very seriously, he felt the edge of a smile that was also slightly painful. There's a video. It's good. But, you weren't there. I was in a meeting about nothing. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I've been in a lot of meetings about nothing. She said it like an admission. More than I'd like to count. Things that could have been emails. Things that should have been emails. I thought that was just the cost of running a company. All these hours that don't produce anything except the feeling that you're working. It's not just the executive floor, I know. She looked at him. I'm beginning to understand that I've been taking that on faith for a long time. The restaurant had thinned out around them. They'd stopped noticing the other tables at some point. When exactly was unclear. But the noise had become background, the other conversations irrelevant, and it was just the corner and the low light, and the two of them at table 14, with empty plates and water glasses that the waiter kept quietly refilling. Can I tell you something? Timothy said. You've been telling me things for an hour and a half. Something I haven't told anyone else. She looked at him steadily, not cautious, not leaning in for drama, just present. Okay, he looked at the table, at the grain of the dark wood, the night Laura died. I was at the office, he felt her go still. He kept going. Ronald Sanchez, my direct manager, called a deadline for 8 p.m. I'd asked about leaving at 6. He said the client brief couldn't wait. He stopped for a breath. Laura called at 7:42. I sent it to voicemail. I was finishing the deck. The words sat there. He let them. The hospital called at 9:47. She'd had the aneurysm around 8:15. I was about 12 blocks away. They said it was fast. They always say that. Fast, he exhaled slowly. I got there at 10:20. She'd been gone for over an hour. Sandra said nothing. She was very still. Sophie was at a friend's house. 6 years old. Sleepover. She had no idea. He turned the water glass once. I drove there and picked her up at 11:30. She was in her pajamas. She thought she was in trouble for staying up. Too late. He stopped. That was the last moment Sophie thought everything was normal. 11:30 on a Thursday. Standing in the Hendersons' front hallway in her pajamas with a stuffed elephant, the sound of the restaurant continued around them. Somewhere a woman laughed at something. A bartender set glasses down on the bar. The world continued being ordinary. "I've never told Nicole that," Timothy said. "I've never told anyone that." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very direct and contained no performance whatsoever. "You were 12 blocks away doing a job that was supposed to matter, and it didn't. And you've been doing the math on that every day since." Not a question. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. She'd said it correctly on the first try, which was something that didn't happen often. "You were trying to keep your family's lights on," Sandra said. "That's what you were doing at the office at 8 p.m. She paused. "You weren't choosing wrong. You were choosing the thing that was supposed to be right." He looked at her. "That doesn't make it easier," she said. "I know that. But it's true." They stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty. The waiter brought the check, and when Timothy moved to take it, Sandra had already placed a card on the folder, which led to a brief and somewhat absurd disagreement that ended with them splitting it, which seemed appropriate for a first date that had been an accidental collision between a CEO and an employee who had no business being at the same table. Outside, the October wind was still doing its work. The street was quieter now. Late enough that the dinner crowd had mostly dispersed, just a few people moving past, a cab idling at the corner, the city doing its overnight recalibration. They stood on the sidewalk. The gap between them was professional. Or at least it was trying to be. Timothy was aware, in a way that registered somewhere below coherent thought, that the last 2 hours had been the most honest conversation he'd had with another adult in 3 years, which was a strange and somewhat uncomfortable thing to know about yourself on a Friday night in October outside a restaurant store you'd almost not walked into. "Thank you," Sandra said, "for not leaving. Thank you for not firing me." She looked at him sharply. Then she laughed. Surprised, genuine, the kind of laugh you don't plan. "The night's not over," noted. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. She was looking at it, and then she said, "What's your full name?" "Timothy Clark," she typed. Her expression was reading something. He watched it change, a small movement, a slight shift, the way faces move when they've found something they weren't expecting. She stopped, looked up at him. He couldn't read what was in her face. He wanted to. He was actively trying to. But it was doing something he didn't have a name for. "Timothy Clark," she said again, not repeating for confirmation. "For something else, that's me." She put the phone back in her pocket. The October wind moved her hair slightly. She looked at him with the same directness she'd had all evening. No more filtered now than it had been an hour into the conversation, when the composed exterior had mostly stopped pretending. "I'm going to see you again," she said. He waited for the question mark. It didn't come. "Okay," he said. She nodded once. Turned and walked toward the parking structure on Huron. He watched her until she turned the corner. Then he turned in the other direction and walked back toward his own car, hands in his pockets, the wind coming off the lake with that particular Chicago insistence. He didn't turn the radio on. Drove home in silence, the city lights moving past the windows, his mind turning over the last 2.5 hours with the methodical, slightly dazed quality of a person trying to catalog an experience that doesn't fit neatly into any existing category. She'd found something when she typed his name. He didn't know what. He knew his own name well enough to know there wasn't anything scandalous in it. No criminal records, no viral moments, no news articles. Just Timothy Clark, 4th floor, marketing, except he had submitted a proposal 3 months ago, 2 months of work. Client outreach restructuring. He'd put numbers to it, built the model carefully, cross-referenced it with 6 quarters of client behavior data. He'd sent it to Ronald Sanchez on a Tuesday morning and received, 11 days later, a 3-line response that said it was being noted as low priority given current company bandwidth. He'd never brought it up again. You learned, on the 4th floor of Anderson and Partners, when to push and when to absorb. He pulled on to Fullerton, parked, turned off the engine. Maybe that was what she'd found. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe she'd looked him up and found the LinkedIn profile with the slightly outdated headshot and lost interest immediately. That would also make sense. That would actually be the more statistically likely outcome of this evening. He sat in the car for 2 minutes. Then he went inside. Mrs. Patterson was on the couch with her knitting. Sophie was already asleep. Mrs. Patterson reported this with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who has successfully executed a mission, accepted her payment, and left with a container of leftover oatmeal cookies that Timothy told her to take home. He checked on Sophie. She was curled on her side, the stuffed elephant, the same one from the night of the Hendersons' sleepover. A fact that no longer gutted him quite the way it once had. Or maybe gutted him differently now, tucked under one arm. The nightlight cast a pale orange glow across the ceiling. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "It's okay," she'd said. "That you're going." She'd known something he hadn't known yet. 9 years old, cereal for dinner, future marine biologist/astronaut. Most honest person he'd ever met. He pulled her door to its usual position, not fully closed, never fully closed, and went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and stood at the sink, looking out the window at the street below, at the ordinary movement of a Friday night winding down. He didn't know what Sandra Anderson had found in her phone. He did know that she'd said she was going to see him again and hadn't waited for him to agree. He drank the water, rinsed the glass, turned off the kitchen light. Something had shifted. He couldn't have told you exactly what, or exactly when, or exactly how to put it back the way it was before. He wasn't sure he wanted to, which was new, which was a thing he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope, exactly. Something smaller and more tentative than hope. A door opened a crack that he'd stopped expecting to open. He went to bed. He didn't sleep right away. He lay in the dark and thought about the water glass she kept turning at the table. The way she'd looked when she said she was tired of being homework. The way she'd heard the thing about Laura and not tried to make it smaller. And he thought about the navy tie in the top drawer, and how he'd put it away tonight, and how, for the first time since he'd folded it into that drawer, putting it away had felt less like a loss and more like a decision. He fell asleep to the sound of the wind off the lake, moving through the city, doing what Chicago wind always did, insisting. The email arrived at 9:03 on Monday morning. Timothy saw it the moment he unlocked his computer. Not because it was the first thing in his inbox. There were 14 emails above it, mostly internal newsletters, and a thread about the broken coffee machine on the 4th floor that had somehow accumulated 22 replies over the weekend. But this one had a different sender field, not the usual department header, not Ronald Sanchez's name in that particular font that Timothy had learned to dread. HR Anderson and Partners Human Resources subject line. Timothy Clark, please report to executive floor. Conference room A10 AM. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time, more slowly, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming on the third pass. They did not. His first thought was, she regrets it. The whole evening. The crying, the confession, the split check, all of it. She'd woken up Saturday morning, gone for a run along the lakefront, had a cold brew and a clear head, and thought, I told an employee about my loneliness, and he told me about his dead wife. And now we have to work in the same building for the foreseeable future, and this is completely untenable. His second thought was, I'm going to be fired for knowing too much, which was not a thought he'd ever expected to have about a first date. Across the floor, Dave from the media buying team was heating something in the microwave that smelled aggressively of fish. Someone's phone kept buzzing against a desk in a pattern such that the owner had stepped away and left it there. The 4th floor was performing its ordinary Monday morning self with complete indifference to the fact that Timothy Clark was sitting at his desk with a stomach that had just relocated somewhere around his shoes. He typed back a confirmation to HR, sent it, then sat very still for approximately 40 seconds, then opened the bottom drawer of his desk and looked at the granola bar he'd been saving for mid-morning because he hadn't had time for breakfast and thought, well, might as well eat this now. In case it's the last meal he had as an employed person. He ate the granola bar. It tasted like cardboard and obligation. The elevator to the 18th floor required a key card Timothy didn't have. So he had to call up from the lobby phone and wait for someone to come down and escort him. The someone turned out to be Angela Young, Sandra's assistant, a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the energy of someone who had professionally managed chaos for long enough that very little surprised her anymore. She didn't ask him anything in the elevator, just stood beside him and looked at the numbers climbing and said, "She's expecting you," in the tone of someone delivering a weather report. factual. Neither reassuring nor alarming. Conference Room A on the 18th floor was not a room Timothy had ever been in. It was the kind of room that communicated, through its furnishings alone, that decisions made here had weight. Long table. Real wood, not laminate. 8 chairs. Windows along the north wall that looked out over the river. The kind of view that reminded you. The city was large, and the building was significant. And the people who worked in this room understood both of those things. Sandra was at the head of the table. Alone. No HR representative, no other executive. Just her in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back, a legal pad and 2 folders in front of her. She looked nothing like the woman at table 14 on Friday night. The posture was different. The eyes were the same. Direct, taking inventory, but everything else was the professional construction. Assembled, precise, in charge. Until he walked in and she said, "Close the door." And then, when he had, "Sit down, Timothy." And the way she said his name had something in it that the conference room furniture was not designed to contain. He sat. She pushed one of the folders across the table without preamble. He opened it. Inside was a printed document he recognized immediately. His own proposal. 2 months of work, 12 pages. The client outreach restructuring model he'd submitted to Ronald Sanchez in July. "I read this Saturday morning," Sandra said. "Then I read it again. Saturday afternoon." She didn't let him respond. "Then I pulled the client retention data from the last 6 quarters and ran your numbers against our actual figures." She opened the second folder, turned it to face him. Her projections, written in a precise hand on the legal pad, transferred to a spreadsheet printout. "Your estimate was 14% retention improvement. My number came out at 16. Timothy looked at the printout. Then at her. "Ronald Sanchez marked this low priority in July," she said. "It never reached my desk." The sentence sat there. "I spent 2 months on that," Timothy said. Calm. He was surprised by the calm, actually. It had arrived from somewhere outside him. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's not why I called you up here. I didn't bring you up here to apologize for Ronald. I brought you up here because Friday night you were the first person in a long time who told me something true, and I woke up Saturday morning realizing I have been running a company on information that's been filtered through people who have reasons. Good personal reasons. To filter it." She paused. "I need to understand what's actually happening below the 18th floor. Not the version I get in Monday briefings. The actual thing." He waited. "I'm not asking you to spy on your colleagues," she said. "I'm asking you to help me see clearly. You know this company from the inside. You've been here 4 years. You're, from what I can tell after 2 hours of reading your work on Saturday, smarter than your current job description suggests." She folded her hands on the table. "I want you to work with me for the next few weeks as an internal consultant. Unofficially at first. No title change, no announcement. Just talk to me. Tell me what you see." He absorbed this. "Ronald, what about him? He'll notice. Let me worry about Ronald Sanchez." Something entered her tone. Not anger, but something with steel underneath it. "Can you do this?" He thought about the granola bar. The emergency internal meeting he'd conducted at his desk 40 minutes ago. The completely unreasonable relief he was currently feeling that this was not, in fact, a termination meeting. "Yes," he said. Ronald Sanchez had been at Anderson and Partners for 11 years. He had the institutional knowledge of someone who had survived 3 rounds of layoffs, 2 economic downturns, and 1 complete executive team turnover. He had a corner office on the 4th floor that was not technically a corner office, but that he had arranged with his desk and his filing cabinets, in a way that created the impression of corners where none existed. He had a way of speaking in meetings that made whatever he said sound inevitable, and a way of listening that made you feel he was cataloging everything for future use. Timothy had worked under Ronald for 4 years and understood him the way you understood weather. Not controllable, not personal. Just a force you accounted for in your planning. Ronald noticed the executive floor email by Tuesday afternoon. Timothy didn't know exactly how. He hadn't told anyone. Angela Young was professionally airtight, and Sandra certainly hadn't announced it. But Ronald had 11 years of antenna, calibrated to the specific frequency of threats to his authority, and Timothy's brief disappearance to the 18th floor had apparently registered. The first sign was the reassignment. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Ronald walked past Timothy's desk and dropped a folder on the corner without stopping. Client brief for Hendricks account. I need the full campaign analysis by Thursday morning. The Hendricks account was a mid-sized retail client with a complicated history and a data set that required approximately 40 hours of work to analyze properly. Thursday's morning was 38 hours away. Timothy looked at the folder, looked at Ronald's retreating back, opened the folder, 40 hours of work, 38 hours of runway. In a week where he was also supposed to be reviewing the internal reporting structure for Sandra, attending 2 standing team meetings, and picking Sophie up from school on Thursday because her after-school program had a teacher in service day, he closed the folder, put it on the left side of his desk, opened his laptop and started working on the Hendricks brief. By Wednesday afternoon, 2 other things had happened. The first was that Marcus Webb, who sat 2 desks over and had been Timothy's closest work friend in the way that work friends existed, which was to say they ate lunch together twice a week and complained about Ronald in the same key, stopped coming by to talk. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just the visits tapered. Marcus started choosing different routes through the floor, started eating lunch at his desk. Timothy noticed this the way you notice a draft. You don't see the window open. You just feel the air change. The second thing was a comment in the Thursday morning team meeting. Ronald was going through the week's deliverables, and when he got to the Hendricks analysis, he looked at Timothy and said, "Clark, I'm going to need that by noon, not 9, pause. I know your time's been divided lately." He said it in the particular way of someone who is making a point without being specific enough to be called on it. Half the room looked at their laptops. The other half looked at Timothy. Timothy said, "It'll be ready," and it was. At 11:47, he sent the completed analysis to Ronald's email and CC'd himself. 71 pages. He'd worked until 1 a.m. on Wednesday. Mrs. Patterson had stayed until 11. He didn't say anything to Sandra about any of this when they met Thursday afternoon. He gave her the reporting structure observations she'd asked for. She listened, took notes on the legal pad, asked specific follow-up questions that showed she'd actually digested everything from their previous conversation. Timothy was discovering, an exceptionally good listener in the context of information she needed. The same focused attention she'd given his words at the restaurant, now deployed toward operational intelligence. What he didn't tell her: Marcus's detour routes, the Hendricks deadline, the way the team meeting had felt like a room with a slow leak. He didn't tell her because it wasn't information. Not yet. It was just the weather. Sophie got sick on a Wednesday. The 3rd Wednesday of October, Timothy's phone buzzed at 11:42 a.m. during a meeting he was in on the 4th floor. Not a Sandra meeting, a regular team meeting, the kind that took place in the smaller conference room with the perpetually broken projector and the coffee that was always either burned or cold. The school's number. He ignored it. 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. Same number. He stepped out into the hallway. The school nurse's voice was professionally calm, in the way of people who spent their days in rooms with sick children. Sophie had spiked a fever of 103.2. She was asking for her dad. Could someone come pick her up? He looked at the conference room door. Through the small rectangular window, he could see the back of Ronald's head at the head of the table. He looked at his phone. Then he texted Sandra, "I have to go. My daughter is sick. I'm sorry about this afternoon." He collected his laptop and his coat. He walked to the elevator without stopping at the conference room. He pressed the lobby button. He left. He did not think about the consequences while he was doing it. There was a small, clear space in his head where only one piece of information existed: Sophie's face. And the nurse's voice saying she was asking for her dad. Everything else, Ronald, the meeting, the unspoken political architecture of his current situation, could wait. Sophie had the flu. A proper, thorough, committed flu that established itself in her body with the seriousness of a long-term tenant. Fever, aches, the works. He got her home by 1:15, installed her on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water, and the television set to her approved sick day programming, and sat in the kitchen, trying to reschedule 3 things and reorganize his week around the reality that Sophie was not going to school for at least 2 days, and Mrs. Patterson was visiting her daughter in Milwaukee, and his backup options were limited. Nicole was in meetings until 6. He texted her anyway. She responded with a voice memo of herself saying, "Oh no, poor baby, and I'll bring soup tomorrow, and you okay?" in rapid succession. He said he was fine. He was mostly fine. The fine was a working fine. The kind that runs the logistics while other parts of the system do something else. At 7:15, Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, the blanket pulled up around her ears, the television still on low. Timothy was standing at the kitchen sink eating peanut butter on a cracker. Not a real meal. Just the thing he'd assembled in the 2-minute window between taking her temperature again and answering an email when he heard a knock at the door. He looked at the door, looked at the cracker in his hand, put it down, opened the door. Sandra Anderson was standing in the hallway of his building, wearing a down coat over what appeared to be normal clothes. Jeans, a sweater, the absence of the blazer and the lanyard and all the other apparatus of the 18th floor. She was holding a paper bag from the deli on Dearborn Street, and she was looking at him with an expression he recognized from the restaurant. The one that was deciding whether to apologize or not, and landing on not. "Angela told me you had to pick up your daughter," she said. "I've eaten dinner alone approximately 400 times in the last year." I thought that was enough. He stood at the doorway for a full 2 seconds processing this information. Then he stepped back and let her in. She came in without ceremony. Set the bag on the counter, looked at the apartment, quickly, not intrusively, the way observant people look at spaces, gathering information without making a production of it. The living room, the bookshelves, the 2 dead plants on the windowsill that he still hadn't thrown out, the photograph on the table by the bedroom door. Laura, taken on a trip to the Smoky Mountains 3 years before she died, laughing at something off camera, her hair blown sideways by the mountain wind. Sandra looked at that photograph for a moment. Then she turned to the kitchen, to the paper bag, and started unpacking it with the focused practicality of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it. "I didn't know what Sophie eats when she's sick," she said, "so I got chicken soup, which is..." I realized that's not creative, but the woman at the deli counter was very confident about it. "So," she set a container on the counter. "There's also a sandwich for you because I'm guessing you haven't eaten a real meal." He looked at the container, looked at her. "How did you know where I live?" "HR has your address on file, a beat. I'm aware that's a concerning thing to say." In context, he agreed. Something about the dry flatness of it made her relax slightly. Not a full shift, just the shoulders dropping 1 degree. "How is she?" Sandra asked. "Sleeping. Flu. Temperature was down to 101 when I checked at 6:30. "That's good. Down is good." She glanced toward the couch, where Sophie was a small lump under the blanket. "She looks like you," Sandra said quietly. Around the eyes, he didn't know what to say to that. He thought about the photo on the bedroom table. Sophie also looked like Laura around the jaw. He'd lived with both truths for 9 years without knowing how to hold them at the same time. "Sit down," Sandra said. "I'll heat the soup." "You don't have to, Timothy," the way she said it. Not commanding. Just direct in the particular way she'd been direct all evening at the restaurant, the part of her that operated without performance when she let it. "Sit down." He sat down. They ate at the kitchen table while Sophie slept on the couch 6 feet away. Sandra had the soup too. She'd bought 2, which meant she'd planned to stay, which was a thing he noticed but didn't examine too closely yet. The kitchen light was the warm kind, the fixture Laura had picked out at a Home Depot on a Saturday morning 4 years ago while Sophie ran in the aisles. "Tell me what's happening with Ronald," Sandra said, halfway through the soup. He looked at her. "You didn't say anything this afternoon," she continued. "In the text, just that Sophie was sick. You didn't mention the meeting. How did you..." Angela tracks the building's meeting calendar. "You were supposed to be in a team meeting when I got your text." Her spoon turned in the soup once. "I need you to tell me so," he told her. The Hendricks brief, the 40-hour analysis, 38-hour deadline, the team meeting comment, Marcus's disappearing lunch visits. He kept his voice flat and factual, same tone he'd use in a presentation, because the flatness was what made it useful instead of personal. Sandra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long has he been doing this, not to Ronald?" "To Timothy, the aggressive deadline thing? This is the first time he's done it to me directly." He paused. "To other people on the team, it's been the climate for a while." "What other people?" "Jenna Krause. She's been on the team 2 years. He buried 2 of her client proposals last spring. She stopped submitting independent work after that. He paused again. Derek Owens. He was up for a team lead position 18 months ago. Ronald told him the position had been eliminated, hired externally 6 weeks later. Sandra set her spoon down. I need you to write that down, she said. Everything you just told me. With dates if you have them, approximate dates if you don't. Can you do that? Yes, don't send it by email. She looked at him directly. Print it out and bring it to me. He understood what she wasn't saying. Email left records that could be accessed. This was still, at this stage, a thing that needed to happen carefully. Okay, he said. She picked up her spoon again. They finished the soup. Somewhere in the city, a siren passed and faded. Sophie shifted on the couch, making a small sound, and both of them looked over. And then Sophie resettled and was quiet, and they both looked back at the table. I owe Jenna Krause and Derek Owens something, Sandra said after a moment. You didn't know, that's exactly the problem. Her voice was even. The evenness was deliberate, he could tell. Something held under careful control. A company is a system. When the system fails someone, it doesn't matter whether the person at the top knew or didn't know. The failure is the same. She looked at him. I've been at the top for 8 years, and I've been telling myself that I can't be everywhere, can't see everything. The managers exist for a reason. And all of that is true. Pause. And apparently I've been using it as an excuse to not look hard enough. He didn't argue with her. He also didn't agree out loud, because agreeing out loud with his CEO about her own failures, while sitting in his kitchen eating deli soup, felt like more than the situation called for. But he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both understood that they were in agreement. The documents Timothy printed were 11 pages. He compiled them over 4 days, cross-referencing emails he'd saved, dates he remembered, names he'd heard mentioned in passing over the years, with the specific weight that meant something important had happened, and no one was going to put it in writing. He was careful and systematic about it, the same way he'd been systematic about the client retention proposal. And when he had all 11 pages, he read them twice, and then put them in a manila envelope, and carried them to the 18th floor on a Tuesday morning. He'd expected Sandra to read them in front of him. She didn't. She took the envelope, set it on the legal pad in front of her, and said she'd review it carefully and be in touch. He left. 2 days later, during his lunch break, he got a text from a number he didn't recognize. New discovery. Can we talk tonight? My office, 6 p.m. He typed back. Yes. At 6 p.m. the building had mostly emptied out. Angela was still at her desk when he stepped off the elevator, which surprised him, until she gave him the same weather report nod she'd given him on the first day, and waved him towards Sandra's office. Sandra was standing at the north window, looking out at the river when he came in. She turned when she heard the door. Her expression was the particular kind of control that requires effort. Sit down, she said. He sat. She stayed standing. I went through Ronald's files this afternoon, she said. Yours wasn't the only proposal he buried. A pause. Over 3 years, he's suppressed or redirected 14 separate proposals from his direct reports. He's submitted 3 of them under his own name, with minor modifications to the executive summary. She stopped. To my desk. I approved 2 of them. The room was very quiet. Additionally, she turned slightly. In the last 18 months, Ronald has been in email correspondence with a company called Meridian Group. They're a competitor, not a direct one. Adjacent space, overlapping client base in the retail sector. She looked at him. The correspondence is about client data, specifically behavioral data from our retail clients. Aggregated but identifiable. He didn't say anything. The words had weight that needed a moment to settle. He's been leaking data, Timothy said finally. The legal team is reviewing it now. Her voice was precise and level and cost her something to maintain that way. What he did to your proposal, to Jenna Krause's proposals, to Derek Owens' career, that I can address directly. What he did with the client data, that goes to the board, to legal, and potentially to the clients themselves. He absorbed this. I'm going to need you to be available for questions from our legal team, Sandra said. They'll want to understand how you came across the pattern and what you observed over 4 years. She paused. I want to be clear about something. You came to me with this. You chose to do that. And I know it wasn't the safe choice. And I need you to know that I understand the difference. He looked at her. What happens now? Ronald is suspended pending investigation, effective tomorrow morning. She moved from the window to the desk, sat down. The board has to be informed. Some of them will be uncomfortable with the speed and the scope of this. One board member in particular has a long-standing relationship with Ronald. Her jaw set slightly. That's my problem. Not yours, it will become mine, he said. On the fourth floor, she looked at him directly. Yes, probably. No softening, no reassurance that wasn't true. I won't insult you by telling you it won't. He appreciated that. He appreciated it more than a reassurance would have been. I can handle the fourth floor, he said. I know you can. She looked at him with the focused directness that had, over the last few weeks, become something he recognized as specifically hers. Not CEO performance, not professional calculation. Just the way she looked at things she was trying to see clearly. Timothy, why did you bring this to me? You could have kept your head down. Ronald would have eventually moved on to a different target. You had options, he thought about Jenna Krause. 11 pages of career damage sustained quietly. 2 proposals buried in a spring she'd apparently stopped expecting to change. Because you asked me to tell you the truth, he said. And because I think you actually meant it. Something moved in her face. I meant it. Then there's your answer. The fourth floor in the week that followed Ronald's suspension was a lesson in organizational behavior. That Timothy filed away in the part of his mind that kept information useful. The suspension announcement was brief and said nothing specific. Administrative review, temporary absence, routine process. The kind of language that was designed to be technically true and informationally empty. Half the floor read between the lines immediately. The other half waited to see which way the wind was blowing before deciding what to believe. Marcus Webb came back to the lunch rotation on Thursday. He sat down across from Timothy with his salad and said, I heard something. He looked at the table. I heard it's bad. He looked up. Did you have something to do with it? Timothy looked at him steadily. I told the truth when someone asked for it. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, he picked up his fork. I've been avoiding you for 2 weeks. I noticed I was scared. He said it plainly, the way you could sometimes say things plainly at a lunch table that you couldn't say anywhere else. I didn't know what was happening and I didn't want to get caught in it. I know. I'm sorry, it's fine. And it was. Mostly, because Marcus wasn't a bad person. He was a person who'd calculated his risk correctly, given the information available to him. And Timothy had spent enough years watching people calculate their risks in environments, shaped by people like Ronald Sanchez, to understand that self-preservation wasn't cowardice, it was just human. What it was not, however, was the choice Timothy had made. And he sat with that distinction privately, without making it a thing he said out loud. The call came on a Thursday night. 11:15 p.m., Sophie had been asleep for 2 hours. Timothy was at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and the quarterly report he'd been asked to review as part of a scope expansion. Sandra was quietly building toward a formal role change. His phone lit up. Sandra's name. He picked up, Tim, just that. The way she'd said his name in conference room A, the one that didn't fit the furniture, Sandra. Silence on the line. Not dead silence. He could hear her breathing, and behind her the ambient sound of wherever she was. Her apartment, probably. She'd mentioned once that it was in the Gold Coast. 12 stories up, a place she described as very nice and very empty. I'm scared, she said. Of the board meeting tomorrow? Not of the board meeting. Another breath. Of after, when this is settled. When Ronald is gone and the board is satisfied and the legal situation is resolved and things go back to whatever normal looks like. She paused. I'm scared that you'll look at me and see the last 6 weeks. All of it. The mess and the investigation and the conflict and the complication. And you'll decide that being in my orbit is not worth it. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed its low constant note. He thought about table 14, the crumpled napkin. The water glass she kept turning. The question she'd asked before he even sat down. Do you want to leave? In a voice that was braced for the answer to be yes. I've been in your orbit for 6 weeks, he said. I know what it looks like. And I'm still here. A pause. Sandra, you know what I see when I look at you? She didn't answer. I see the person who showed up at my apartment with soup on a school night because I texted that my daughter was sick. He said it simply. No performance. I see the person who sat at her desk on a Saturday morning and read a page proposal from a 4th floor employee she'd never spoken to and ran the numbers herself. He stopped. You don't have to be not messy for me to see you clearly. The line was quiet. I'm also a mess, he added. In case that was unclear, a sound on her end. Not quite a laugh, not quite a breath. Something that was both. It was not unclear. Then we're even. She was quiet for another moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Lower, less controlled in the particular way that meant the controlled layer had been set aside voluntarily. The board meeting is at 9, I know. Whatever they decide about Ronald, the legal side of it, it won't change what I'm doing about the rest. The buried proposals. The people he suppressed, she paused. It won't change what I owe them. I know that too. Okay, a breath, okay. Good night, Timothy, good night. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call ended. The quarterly report stayed closed. The glass of water went mostly undrunk. Outside the window, Chicago at 11:30 on a Thursday night was doing the thing Chicago did. Continuing undeterred, with the specific relentlessness of a city that had been through worse and was not particularly impressed with whatever was currently happening. He thought about the question she hadn't asked, but that was underneath everything she had asked. Are you going to stay? And he thought about the fact that he was sitting at his kitchen table at 11:30 p.m., reviewing a quarterly report at Sandra Anderson's request, and that the thing he felt about that was not obligations or calculation or the careful management of professional risk. The thing he felt was, he wanted to do it. He wanted to be useful to her. He wanted to be in the room when she needed someone in the room. He wanted to be the person she called at 11:15 on a Thursday night, not because he was the most strategic choice, but because he was the one she wanted to talk to, which was information. New information. The kind that arrives before you're ready for it and doesn't ask your permission. He picked up the quarterly report, started reading. The refrigerator hummed. The city continued, and Timothy Clark sat in the kitchen light and let the new information be what it was. Ronald Sanchez was officially terminated on a Friday afternoon in late October, not the Friday of the board meeting. That Friday produced only a formal investigation and a temporary suspension extended indefinitely, which was the corporate equivalent of a held breath. The actual termination came 3 weeks later, after the legal team had finished their review, after the settlement agreement had been drafted and signed, after the 2 board members, who'd initially pushed back on the speed of the process, had been shown the Meridian Group email chain in its entirety and gone quiet. 3 weeks of held breath. On the 4th floor, people worked and speculated and calculated their positions. The anonymous HR complaint about conflict of interest arrived in the 2nd week. A single email, no name, flagged automatically by the system and routed to the HR director, who called Sandra before doing anything else with it. Sandra called Timothy that same afternoon. Not from her office, from her cell, which meant she was somewhere the walls had ears, and she'd decided the street was safer. Her voice was level in the way it got when she was processing something difficult and choosing her words with care. HR received a complaint about us. Conflict of interest given your pending role change. Timothy was at his desk. He kept his voice the same level as hers. What happens now? They investigate. Standard process. I'm going to recommend you report to the CFO David Park, instead of directly to me, effective immediately. A pause. I know how that sounds. I want you to hear why. I'm listening. Because if this role change is going to mean anything, if it's going to survive the scrutiny it's going to get, it has to be clean. Every step. Every decision traceable to merit and not to me. Her voice was precise and cost her something to maintain that way. I'm not doing this to protect myself. I'm doing it to protect the thing you've actually earned. He sat with that for a moment. The 4th floor hummed around him. Someone across the room laughed at something. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Completely ordinary. Okay, he said. Okay? You're making the right call, he meant it. Do what you need to do. A silence on the line. Then quieter. I wasn't sure how you'd take it, Sandra. He kept his voice low. You just explained your reasoning instead of handing me a decision. That's more than most people do, he paused. I'll go introduce myself to David Park, she exhaled. Not dramatically, just the breath of someone who'd been holding something and set it down. He already knows you're coming. I called him 20 minutes ago. Of course you did. I'm efficient. You're terrifying. A beat. I mean that respectfully. This time she actually laughed. Small, real. The laugh from table 14 that she hadn't been planning on. The panel interview for Director of Marketing Strategy took place on a Thursday morning in Conference Room B. Not A, the smaller one, the one without the river view. with 3 executives and no Sandra. David Park from finance, whose questions were precise and numerical, and occasionally brutal in their specificity. Lisa Carver from operations, who asked about management philosophy with the patient thoroughness of someone who'd hired badly before and learned from it. And Greg Nowak from client services, who'd been at the company 12 years, and who listened to Timothy's answers with the particular attention of someone deciding whether the person across the table was real or performing. It lasted 90 minutes. Timothy answered every question with the same directness he'd given Sandra in conference room A's 6 weeks earlier. He didn't oversell. He didn't perform confidence he didn't have. When Nowak asked about his approach to team conflict, he said what he actually thought, which was that most team conflict was information that wasn't being heard yet, and his job was to make the hearing happen before the conflict had to. Nowak wrote something on his notepad. Timothy couldn't see what it was. He found out 4 days later in a brief email from HR. The position was his. Start date 3 weeks out, to allow for transition planning. Salary structure attached, with a performance review built in at 6 months. He read the email at his desk. Read it again. Forwarded it to Nicole with no comment. She called him in 40 seconds. Literally 40 seconds. Oh my God, Tim. Her voice was at a volume that caused Marcus Webb, 3 desks over, to look up in mild alarm. I'm putting it on the family group chat. Do not put it on the family group chat. I'm putting it on the family group chat. She put it on the family group chat. His aunt in Naperville sent 17 fire emojis. His cousin responded with a gif of a man falling off a chair in apparent celebration. His mother, who'd been told the bare outline of the situation over the phone 2 weeks prior, and had responded with characteristic Midwestern compression. Well, that's a lot, honey. Are you eating? Texted back. See? I told you. She had not in fact told him anything of the sort, but he let her have it. He told Sophie that night over dinner. Real dinner. He'd made pasta, the kind with the Italian sausage that Sophie considered the apex of home cooking, a judgment she had formed at age 6 and never revised. He'd been deliberately normal all afternoon, picking her up from school, listening to the detailed account of a social situation involving 2 girls and 1 jump rope that had apparently required significant diplomatic intervention. He'd let her talk through the whole thing and offered his analysis when asked, and did not mention the email until they were both sitting down with food in front of them. I got a promotion today, he said. Sophie looked up. How promoted? Pretty promoted. New title. Different floor. More money. She processed this with the focused seriousness she brought to information she considered important. Which floor? 7th. Is that closer to Sandra's floor? He looked at his pasta. Not directly. A pause. Sandra's still at 18. Sophie nodded slowly. Twirled spaghetti around her fork. Are you and Sandra going to be okay? Because of the work stuff? The question sat in the kitchen air. Outside, the last of October's light was doing the long, slow exit through the west-facing window. Inside, his 9-year-old had just asked a question with about 4 layers of awareness built into it. We're okay, he said. You seem okay. She ate a bite. You've been less tired looking lately. Less tired looking. You used to look tired around your eyes all the time. Sandra's the one who fixed that, right? She said it with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to scientific observations. Just information. Just a thing she'd noticed and was now reporting. He looked at her. You don't miss much, do you? Nope. She reached for her water glass. I think you should tell her you like her, if you haven't already. Because you're really obvious, Dad. He opened his mouth, closed it. Eat your pasta, Sophie said. He ate his pasta. He told Sandra he liked her on a Wednesday evening, in the parking garage of the building, which was not the setting he would have chosen if he'd been given advance notice that the conversation was going to happen. But feelings, in his experience, did not schedule themselves around convenient settings. They'd been walking out together after a late meeting. He was on 7 now. She was still on 18, but the building's parking structure was shared, and the elevator bank at the end of the day sometimes deposited people together, without any planning involved. She was telling him about a call she'd had with a client in Detroit, something about a contract renewal that had gotten complicated. And he was listening, and they were walking through the low concrete light of the B-level garage, and she was halfway through a sentence about Q4 projections when he stopped walking. She stopped, turned. What? He looked at her. Just looked for a moment because he'd been organizing words for approximately 2 weeks, and in the actual moment all the organized words were, "Somewhere else, I like you," he said. Exactly that. No preamble. I wanted to say it directly. In case it wasn't clear, Sandra looked at him. The parking garage hummed its low fluorescent hum. A car pulled out of a space 2 rows over. "It was," she said finally. "Clear, a beat. I like you too." In case that wasn't clear, it was. He paused. So, she agreed. They stood there in the parking garage for another 5 seconds, which was the amount of time required for 2 people who had just stated a mutual fact to figure out what to do with it. Then Sandra said, "I have dinner plans with Angela tomorrow. Saturday is open." A pause. If Sophie isn't busy, Sophie is never busy on Saturdays. Good. She turned back toward her car, Millennium Park. 2 o'clock, she walked away. He stood there for a second, then went to his own car, Sybil, direct, no performance. He drove home thinking that was the most Sandra thing that had ever happened. And also the most him thing. And maybe that was the point of the whole situation. Sophie wore her good jacket. The navy one with the buttons. Timothy had mentioned in passing that they were meeting Sandra at the park. Casual thing, just a walk. Sophie could stay home if she wanted. Sophie had nodded with extreme nonchalance, and then spent 25 minutes getting ready, which, for a child who usually treated clothing as purely functional, was information. Millennium Park on a Saturday in November was its own particular version of beautiful. The trees had finished their October performance and were down to the structural truth of bare branches, but the sky was the high cold blue that Chicago brought sometimes in the in-between months. And the plaza was alive with the specific energy of a city, taking its weekend seriously. Sandra was at the bench near the Crown Fountain. Jeans, a camel coat. No lanyard, no badge, no apparatus. Her hair was down, which Timothy had seen at the restaurant, but which still registered as a different person from the 18th floor version. She stood when she saw them coming. He watched her notice Sophie and do a thing he recognized from conference room A. The rapid internal calibration, the assessment and adjustment, the deciding how to be in a new situation. Sophie assessed her back. This lasted approximately 4 seconds. The federal judge energy deployed in full. "Hi," Sophie said. First mover, confident. "Hi," Sandra said. Sophie said like she was confirming a real thing, not performing an introduction. Sophie put out her hand. Formal handshake. Sandra took it with complete seriousness, which was the correct response. "Do you like dolphins?" Sophie asked. Sandra didn't laugh. Timothy would later reflect that this was the key moment, because Sophie asked that question to every adult she met for the first time, and the ones who laughed or deflected or said something condescending about what a fun question that was, those people got filed into a specific category in Sophie's internal taxonomy. The ones who answered directly got filed somewhere else. "I love dolphins," Sandra said, "particularly the way they use echolocation. The fact that they see through sound seems like something a superpower should feel like." Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then, to Timothy, with the same tone she used to confirm scientific facts. "Dad, I like her." They walked for 2 hours. The 3 of them. Sophie in the middle sometimes, holding both their hands, which was something she'd never done with any adult who wasn't Timothy or Nicole, and which Timothy noticed without looking at it too directly, the way you notice something that matters by looking slightly to the side of it. Sandra asked Sophie about the jump rope diplomacy situation from Tuesday. Sophie explained it in full. Sandra listened and asked follow-up questions with the quality of attention that suggested she was genuinely interested, not performing interest, not calculating the right adult response, just listening to a 9-year-old describe a Wednesday at recess with the same focus she brought to client retention numbers. Sophie ran ahead at one point to look at something near the fountain, and Sandra moved slightly closer to Timothy and said quietly, "She's extraordinary, she is," he said. "She knows things." Sandra watched Sophie crouch down to examine something on the pavement with scientific focus. "She looks at you and she knows things, always has. Since she was 3, she'd say things that, yeah," he paused. "Laura was like that too." That particular kind of seeing, Sandra looked at him, not with the careful pity-adjacent expression people sometimes got. With something cleaner than that. You gave her that. Even when you couldn't see yourself clearly, you gave her someone to watch who tries to do the right thing. A beat. She told me in the first 5 minutes that her dad was obvious. which I took as a compliment. He looked at her sideways. She told you that while you were tying your shoe. She's very efficient. She gets that from. He stopped. Something moved in his chest. Complicated. The way things were sometimes complicated, layered in the way that happiness and loss shared the same address in his body, and he'd learned to let them coexist. She gets it from a few places. Sandra reached over and briefly, lightly took his hand. Not a statement, not a declaration, just contact. Just the simple fact of her hand in his for a few steps before she let go. It was enough, more than enough. The M&A offer arrived in the 5th month. He found out the way he found out things he wasn't supposed to know yet. Through a combination of Angela Young's inadvertent calendar reference and his own ability to read the specific atmospheric pressure that accumulated in a building when something significant was happening on the top floor. The offer was from a private equity-backed holding group based on the East Coast. A serious number. Sandra's lawyer had apparently used the word generational when describing it, which was the kind of word that meant retire at 32 and never think about Q4 again. 200 employees. Their jobs technically negotiable in the deal structure, but realistically subject to the new owner's vision. Their careers, their benefits, their everything. He found out on a Tuesday. She hadn't told him. Wednesday went by. Thursday. He went about his week on the 7th floor, with the knowledge sitting in him like a stone he was carefully working around. Friday morning, he walked to the 18th floor without scheduling anything. Angela looked up when he stepped off the elevator, and her face did a thing she immediately controlled, which confirmed everything. "Is she in?" he said. Yes. A pause. "Timothy. I'll just be a minute." He knocked on Sandra's office door, opened it without waiting. She was at her desk, laptop open, phone face down, the posture of someone who had been doing a thing and was now stopped mid-thing. She looked up and immediately knew. He could see it happen, the recognition that the thing she'd been not saying was no longer something she could not say. He closed the door, stood in front of her desk. "An acquisition offer," he said. Not a question. She sat back in her chair. Exhaled. "Who told you?" "Nobody told me." A pause. "How long?" "I've known for 11 days. The number landed. 11. He did the math quickly. That was before last Saturday at Millennium Park, before the Tuesday phone call, before the parking garage conversation. All of those had happened while she was carrying something she hadn't said. "I'm not angry about the deal," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever you decide about your company is your decision." He stopped. "I'm angry because you've been sitting across from me for 11 days and you didn't say anything." She looked at the desk, then at him. "I know. You told me once that the only thing that made our situation work was that you'd tell me the truth." His voice was even, carefully even. "You said that at a kitchen table, over soup that you brought, because you didn't want to eat alone again. Do you remember that?" "Yes." "So what happened?" She was quiet. Not the CEO quiet, the other kind, the table 14 kind. The one where the performance had been set down and what was left was just her, figuring out how to say something true. "I was scared," she said finally. "Not of the deal, of what you'd think, of you looking at me and thinking I was the kind of person who takes an exit when things get hard." A pause. "Of you deciding I was a flight risk," her voice, stripped down. "Of losing you over something I hadn't even decided yet." He stood there. The office was quiet. The river, 11 floors below the window he couldn't currently see, was doing what rivers did. "Sandra." He moved to the chair across from her desk. Sat down. "I'm not going anywhere because you're considering an offer. I would have gone somewhere if you'd kept considering it without telling me." He looked at her directly. "There's a difference. Do you understand that?" She held his gaze. "Yes. Okay." He settled back in the chair. "Tell me about the offer," and she did, all of it. The number, the structure, the timeline, the board's enthusiasm, her lawyer's enthusiasm, the part where she'd sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes afterward, feeling nothing she expected to feel. She told him about calling her mother in Sarasota, and her mother saying, "Well, Sandra, the question isn't whether it's enough money, you know that." She told him that she'd been running the company for 8 years, and had built something real, and the idea of handing it to people who would optimize it for returns made her feel a specific kind of hollow that she didn't have better words for. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he said, "What do you want?" She looked at the window. "I want to finish what I started." She said it quietly, and it was clearly true. I want to be here when Jenna Krause submits her next proposal. I want to see Derek Owens take the team lead position he was passed over for. I want to build what this company was supposed to be before it got. Before I stop looking, she paused. I want to not sell it to people who'll turn it into a number on a spreadsheet. Then don't, he said. It's a lot of money. You have a lot of money. It's a lot more money, Sandra. He looked at her steadily. You just told me what you want. I'm not sure what we're still discussing. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not in the movie way, just the small, specific relaxation of a person who has been carrying something and found the thing was lighter with someone else aware of the weight. You're right, she said. I know. You're also, she said, absurdly calm about all of this. I sat in a car for 4 minutes on a Friday night trying to decide if I was going to go into a restaurant, he said. After that, most things seemed manageable. She declined the offer the following Tuesday. The board was notified. Her lawyer made the call to the holding group. Angela sent the calendar invites for the communications plan. And Sandra Anderson. At 32, having turned down a number with several zeros that her 24-year-old self could not have conceived of, went back to running her company. The morning after the decline was official, Timothy found a handwritten note on his desk on the 7th floor. He didn't know when it had been left there. It was on Anderson and Partners' letterhead in Sandra's particular compressed handwriting, and it said, "It occurred to me that I made a major professional decision significantly influenced by a conversation in my office on Friday afternoon. I want you to know that wasn't an accident." Sehi read it twice, put it in the top drawer of his desk. Not the same drawer, a different one, the one without history. The kitchen floor conversation happened on a Thursday. He didn't plan it. Sophie didn't plan it either. She wasn't the kind of child who planned emotional conversations the way she planned everything else, which was itself interesting, that this was the one category she left unscheduled. She was at the kitchen table, homework arranged in her precise semicircle, and he was rinsing dishes, and the apartment was quiet in the particular way of 8:30 on a school's night. "Dad," Sophie said, does Mom know you're happy now?" He turned off the faucet. The water stopped. He stood there with the dish towel in his hand. Turned around, Sophie was looking at him with Laura's eyes. The directness, the particular quality of attention that wasn't demanding an answer, just genuinely asking. 9 years old. Completely serious. And something happened in him that he hadn't planned for and couldn't have prepared for. Not grief exactly. He knew what grief felt like. He'd lived in it. He knew its specific texture by now. This was something adjacent. The crack in a wall that had been there for 3 years. The one he'd been navigating around and maintaining carefully, finally. Not breaking, but releasing. The difference between a break and a release was that one was damage and one was breathing. He set the dish towel down on the counter. He walked to the kitchen table, and then he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. Not in front of anyone. Not where Sophie could see. He sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and he put his face in his hands. Sophie's chair scraped, small feet on the kitchen tile. Then she was sitting beside him on the floor, her small shoulder against his arm, her stuffed animal weight settling against his side. She didn't say anything for a minute. He didn't either. The kitchen was very still. She would have liked Sandra, Sophie said eventually. Mom. She liked people who were honest even when it was awkward. She paused. Sandra's really honest. He lifted his head, looked at Sophie. Her face was so familiar it was sometimes almost unbearable. The same, and its own thing simultaneously, the way all children were themselves, and also something inherited. She told me once she was lonely, Sophie continued. At the park, when you were getting water. I asked her if she was okay and she said yes, but I kept looking at her until she told the truth. She said it without pride. Just reporting. I told her we used to be lonely too, me and you. But not as much anymore. She looked at him directly. She cried a little bit. She tried to hide it, but she didn't do a very good job. He looked at his daughter. You interrogated Sandra at Millennium Park. I prefer asked important questions. He laughed. Real laugh, unexpected, the kind that arrived from somewhere past the complicated layer. Sophie grinned, the gap-toothed grin. The one that was entirely her own, nobody else's. Just Sophie's contribution to the world. I miss Mom, Sophie said. Simple, not broken by it. Just true. Me too, he said. Just as simply. But I think it's okay to also be happy. She leaned her head against his arm. Those can both be true at the same time, right? He looked at the kitchen ceiling. At the light fixture Laura had picked out at a Home Depot on a Saturday morning 4 years ago, while Sophie ran in the aisles. At the ordinary ceiling of an ordinary kitchen, in an ordinary apartment in Chicago, which had been a holding pattern and was becoming, slowly and without announcement, a home. Again, yeah, he said. They can both be true. He bought the ring with Sophie on a Saturday morning in November. A small shop in Lincoln Square, the neighborhood where the streets still had German bakeries and the shop windows changed with the seasons. And everything felt slightly more intentional than the rest of the city. Sophie had been briefed the night before with full operational detail. Where they were going, what they were doing, the non-negotiable requirement that she not tell anyone, especially not Angela Young, who Sophie had correctly identified as the most likely information leak in their immediate circle. Sophie took the secrecy agreement extremely seriously. She'd asked for it in writing. Timothy had written, "Sophie Clark agrees not to tell anyone about the ring," on a sticky note and signed it, and she'd stuck it to her nightstand, which was both unnecessary and perfect. The jeweler was a woman named Mrs. Park, who had been selling rings in Lincoln Square for 31 years and had the particular patience of someone who had watched many nervous men try to describe what they wanted. Sophie told Mrs. Park what they were looking for. Simple, not flashy, something that looked like a real person wore it, and not like it was trying to prove something. With enough specificity that Mrs. Park immediately pulled 3 options from the case. Sophie studied all 3, picked up the middle one, held it toward the window light, the way she'd apparently seen someone do in a video she'd watched specifically to prepare for this errand, which Timothy only learned about after the fact. "This one," Sophie said. He looked at it. Clean setting, round stone, honest. "Exactly right. Yeah," he said. Mrs. Park smiled the smile of a woman who had been right about many things over 31 years. "Good choice." He carried the box in his coat pocket for 6 days. He was aware of it at all times. Every jacket, every coat, every time he reached for his phone or his keys, his hand registered the small velvet box with the specific awareness you have of things that matter. Sophie lasted 4 days before she started vibrating with contained information. By day 5, she was blinking very rapidly in Sandra's presence, which was Sandra's tell that something was happening that she hadn't been told about. On day 5, in Timothy's kitchen while Sophie was theoretically doing homework, Sandra looked at Timothy across the room and said, very quietly, "She knows something." "She's fine," he said. "She blinked 40 times in the last minute. She's just..." "Timothy, I'm handling it," he said. Said Sandra, which was the sound she made when she was certain he was wrong, but was choosing not to press it. He was slightly wrong. Sophie held on for one more day, which was the day, Millennium Park. A Saturday afternoon in late November. The fountain was winterized, quiet, the water off for the season. The sky was the clear, cold blue of the good Chicago days, the ones that arrived between weather systems and felt like a gift. The bare trees along the paths were doing the structural thing. All line and branch, the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself. Sandra was at their bench, the one where they'd met the first time, the 3 of them. She was looking out at the plaza when he saw her from 20 yards away. And the thing that happened in his chest was the same thing that had been happening for months now, and he'd stopped trying to categorize it and was just letting it be what it was. Sophie was beside him, holding his hand. She had been holding his hand since they left the car, which she hadn't done since she was 7. She was gripping it now with the intensity of someone who was carrying significant information and needed an anchor. "You okay?" he said. "Fine," Sophie said. Very high voice. "Totally fine. Let's just walk normal." He looked down at her. "Eyes forward, Dad." He kept his eyes forward. Sandra stood when they reached the bench. She looked at Sophie first, registered the jacket, the grip, the slightly elevated blinking rate, and then looked at Timothy. Her eyes moved to his coat pocket, back to his face. She was very still. He reached into his pocket. Sophie made a sound that was technically not a sound, but was definitely a sound. He went down on one knee in front of the bench in Millennium Park on a Saturday afternoon in late November and opened the velvet box and looked up at Sandra Anderson. She had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were, not the restaurant crying, not the Table 14 version, something entirely different. Something that had no performance in it at all. Sandra. His voice was steady. He didn't know how, but it was. You walked into a restaurant expecting nothing and left with a stranger's secrets. You showed up at my door with soup on a school night. You made every hard call the right way. Even when the right way was harder, he paused. I want to keep doing this, all of it. The dinners and the park and the kitchen table arguments and the Sophie interrogations and every ordinary Tuesday. I want to do it with you. He looked at her. Marry me, Sophie said in a whisper that was not technically a whisper. Say yes, say yes, say yes. Sandra laughed through the tears. The kind of laugh that arrives with tears when something is too big for just one emotional channel. Yes, she said. Her voice wasn't steady. Yes, obviously, yes. She reached for him as he stood, and he put the ring on her finger. And Sophie threw both arms around both of them simultaneously with the full body commitment of a child who had been holding a secret for 6 days and was finally released. I didn't tell anyone, Sophie announced into both their coats. Well, I told Angela, Sophie, Timothy said. She already kind of knew, and she promised. And she's going to be so happy, Sandra, still laughing. She texted me this morning saying wear the camel coat. He looked at the camel coat, looked at Sophie. You too, eyes forward, Dad, Sophie said. The wedding was 43 people on a Saturday in October, a year and 2 weeks from the night at the Greystone. A garden venue in the western suburbs, white string lights in the trees, chairs on actual grass, the specific smell of October in Illinois, that was dry leaves and cold air, and something underneath both of those things that didn't have a name. Nicole Torres cried from the moment she arrived. Not quietly. Nicole did very few things quietly, which was one of her most useful qualities, and occasionally her most exhausting one. Angela Young sat in the second row, in a yellow dress that was technically outside the requested color palette, and nobody said a word about it, because Angela had earned the yellow dress, and everyone present understood this. Sophie walked the aisle first, flower girl, navy dress, basket of white rose petals, expression of someone performing a mission with the gravity it deserved. She dropped each petal with deliberate precision, looking at her feet, then ahead, then her feet again. Halfway down she looked up and found Timothy at the altar and broke into the gap-toothed grin. So briefly it was almost only for him, and then went back to her professional focus. He was not going to survive this. He already knew. He'd known since approximately 7 a.m. that morning, when Sophie came into his room in her pajamas and sat on the edge of his bed and said, Dad, I just want to say, I think today is going to be good, said it the way she stated facts. Not predictions. Facts. The music changed. Sandra appeared at the end of the aisle. Simple dress. White, not the architectural kind, not the statement-making kind, just white, just hers, hair down. The camel coat was not present, which was noted by Angela and Sophie and probably no one else. She walked without a person beside her, which she'd decided months ago with the specific independence that was one of the things he loved most about her. She'd said, I've been walking into rooms by myself for 8 years. I'd like to walk into this one the same way. She walked toward him. He watched her walk toward him. And the thing that happened was not what he expected. He'd expected the complicated layered thing, the bittersweet presence of everything the room wasn't. He'd expected to feel Laura in the space, the absence alongside the presence, the way happiness and grief coexisted in him. He felt all of that. He did. It was there. But underneath it, louder, clearer, just this. Just Sandra, walking toward him, and Sophie beside Nicole in the front row, and 43 people gathered around one fact, that 2 people had sat across from each other in a restaurant corner, and told each other the truth when every reasonable instinct said not to. She reached the altar, took his hands. Her hands were steady. His were the ones that weren't, which she noticed and said nothing about, and held more firmly because of. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. The officiant spoke. Then looked at him. He'd written the vows on a Tuesday night at the kitchen table after Sophie was asleep, and he'd revised them 3 times, and in the end the version that was true was shorter than all the earlier versions, which felt right. Sandra. His voice went the way he'd expected it to go. He let it. A year ago, I sat in my car for 4 minutes trying to decide if I was going to walk into a restaurant. I almost didn't, he paused, and then I did. And you were sitting at a table doing the same thing I'd been doing for 3 years. Trying to hold yourself together in a situation that didn't have good options. He held her gaze. You didn't need rescuing. I didn't either. We just needed someone to sit down and stay. A breath. I'm going to keep sitting down. Every day. Whatever the day looks like. He stopped. Said it simple. I love you. I'm going to love you for the rest of my life. Sandra had gone very still. The controlled layer was completely gone. She took a breath, took another. Looked at him with the absolute unmediated version of herself. The one from table 14. The one that had been there all along underneath everything else. Timothy, she started, stopped, started again. I spent a long time believing that the price of the life I was building was this, being alone, that I couldn't have both. Her voice was careful and real. You didn't argue with me about that. You just kept showing up and being honest until I couldn't believe it anymore. She squeezed his hands. You and Sophie changed what I thought was possible for me. And I don't have a better way to say it than that. You changed what I thought was possible. She stopped. I love you, both of you. That's my whole vow. In the front row, Sophie was not crying. Sophie was 9, and she had certain dignities to maintain, and crying was not on the day's approved list. But her chin was doing the thing, the wobbling thing. She was looking at the ground, and her chin was wobbling, and Nicole, beside her, put an arm around her shoulders, and Sophie leaned into it without looking up. The officiant said the words. He kissed her. She kissed him back. The 43 people made the sound that 43 people make when a thing they've been waiting for finally arrives. Sophie launched herself forward and wrapped her arms around both of them at once and said, somewhere in the vicinity of their elbows, "You're married. Can I call you Mom now?" I've been wanting to ask for a while. Sandra went down to Sophie's level. Her mascara was entirely beyond saving at this point. Yes, she said. Her voice broke clean through on that single syllable. Of course you can, Sophie held on. Sandra held on. Timothy put his hand on Sophie's back and felt the three of them, the full fact of them, and thought about a parking lot and a Friday night, and a question of whether to go inside. And the answer, it turned out, had always been yes. He just hadn't known it yet. 3 months later. A Sunday morning, February in Chicago, which was the month that tested your relationship with the city and found out whether you actually meant it. The kitchen was warm. Sophie was at the table eating cereal. Still a universal food, still applicable to all occasions and emotional states. And apparently also to Sunday mornings in February, and telling them about a dream involving dolphins with regional accents. Sandra was at the other end of the table, with her reading glasses on, the ones she'd never worn to the office until recently, scanning something on her laptop, with particular focused quiet of someone who had learned how to be still in a room with other people. And found, to her own surprise, that she liked it. Timothy was at the counter with the coffee. He knew without asking that Sandra's was a medium pour with a small amount of the good creamer, and he made it that way and set it down beside her, without either of them saying anything about it. She reached over and touched his hand. Quick, light, set her hand back on the table. Outside the kitchen window, Chicago was being February. Gray sky, bare trees, lake wind doing its insistent work against the glass. Everything waiting, the way cities waited in winter, for the particular permission of spring to arrive and make everything complicated again in the best possible way. Inside the kitchen, cereal and coffee and Sophie's dolphin dream, which had apparently involved a bottlenose with a very specific Boston accent and strong opinions about fish taxonomy. The plants on the windowsill, 2 new ones, replacing the ones that hadn't survived the holding pattern years, green and alive, and slightly too large for the sill already, reaching toward the gray February light, with the patient optimism of things that intend to keep growing, regardless of conditions. Sophie paused her dolphin story, looked at both of them across the table with the full federal judge consideration, the assessment, the inventory, the deliberation. Then she delivered her verdict. This is good, she said. Not specifically to either of them. Not a compliment, a finding. The conclusion of a 9-year-old who had been collecting evidence for months and had now reached a determination she was prepared to stand behind. He looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at him. The small private language that had been building between them since a parking garage conversation, and a navy tie in a drawer, since soup on a school night, and 11 pages of documentation, and a man on one knee in a November park, and 43 people in a garden in October, watching 2 people who'd been holding themselves together for years, finally decide to hold each other instead. Yeah, Timothy said. Outside, Chicago continued being February, indifferent and insistent and entirely itself. Inside, the coffee was hot, and the cereal was whatever cereal Sophie had determined was appropriate to Sunday mornings, and the two plants on the windowsill were already, quietly, too big for where they'd been put, still growing. Both of them, which was, Timothy thought, exactly right.